late November 1943, Imperial Japanese Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. The room is thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of unwanted truth. Fluorescent lights hum overhead, casting pale shadows across a polished mahogany table. Spread before a circle of senior officers are reconnaissance photographs, grainy black and white images taken by long-range scout planes and intelligence operatives operating from neutral territories. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito leans forward, his finger tracing the outline of a massive shipyard in the photograph. Newport News, Philadelphia, Mare Island. The names are foreign, distant, almost abstract, but the images are not. Row after row of hulls, carriers in various stages of completion, destroyers lined up like toys in a factory. One photograph shows seven aircraft carriers under construction simultaneously at a single facility. Ito removes his glasses. He does not speak immediately. Around him, younger staff officers shift in their seats, waiting for someone to say what they all know. Finally, a captain breaks the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. This is from 1 year. Just 1 year. No one responds. In the stillness, something cracks. Not in the room, but within the men themselves. Some close their eyes. Others stare blankly at the photographs, as if willing them to be false. One officer, a decorated veteran of the China campaign, lowers his head into his hands. They are not weeping from fear. They are weeping because they have finally understood. The war they thought they could win has already been lost. To understand the despair in that Tokyo conference room, you must first understand what the Imperial Japanese Navy believed about itself and about war. For decades, Japanese naval doctrine had been built on a single seductive idea: quality over quantity. Japan could never match the industrial output of larger nations, so it would build fewer ships but make each one superior. Bigger guns, thicker armor, better trained crews. The logic was elegant, almost poetic. A smaller force of elite vessels commanded by elite sailors could defeat a larger but mediocre enemy fleet. This philosophy reached its ultimate expression in the Yamato-class battleships, displacing over 70,000 tons fully loaded, armed with 18-inch guns that could hurl a shell weighing nearly 3,000 pounds over 25 miles. Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were the largest, most powerful battleships ever built. They were symbols not just of naval strength but of national will. Japan had poured its limited resources into these titans, gambling that individual excellence could overcome numerical disadvantage. The strategy seemed validated in the early months of the Pacific War. On December 7, 1941, Japanese carrier aircraft struck Pearl Harbor, crippling the American Pacific Fleet's battleship force in a single morning. In the weeks that followed, Japanese forces swept across Southeast Asia and the Pacific with stunning speed. Hong Kong fell. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered. The Philippines were overrun. American, British, and Dutch forces were shattered in a series of swift, brutal engagements. By mid-1942, Japan controlled an empire stretching from the Aleutians to the Indian Ocean, from China to the Solomon Islands. But Pearl Harbor, for all its tactical brilliance, had a fatal flaw. It was designed to buy time, not to destroy capacity. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the attack, understood this better than anyone. He had lived in the United States. He had seen American factories, American highways, American oil fields. He knew what his superiors in Tokyo either did not know or refused to believe, that America's industrial strength was not merely greater than Japan's, it was greater by an order of magnitude that made conventional comparison meaningless. Yamamoto had warned them. In private conversations and classified reports, he insisted that Japan could run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, American production would begin to tip the scales. If the war dragged on, if it became a contest of industrial endurance rather than tactical brilliance, Japan would lose. Not might lose, would lose. His warnings were noted, filed, and largely ignored. Tokyo's strategic planning remained rooted in the belief that a series of decisive victories would force America to negotiate a settlement. The idea that America would choose to outbuild Japan, to drown the Imperial Navy in a flood of steel, seemed almost inconceivable. Even as Japanese forces celebrated their early victories, the foundation of their defeat was already being laid. In the spring and summer of 1942, as Japanese troops dug in on Guadalcanal and Japanese carriers clashed with American forces at Midway and the Coral Sea, something was happening on the other side of the Pacific, something quiet, something relentless. American shipyards were coming alive. The transformation of American naval production did not begin with Pearl Harbor. It began 2 years earlier in the summer of 1940 when the world watched France collapse under the weight of German armored divisions. President Franklin Roosevelt, seeing the U-tour with brutal clarity, pushed through Congress the Two-Ocean Navy Act. It was the largest naval expansion program in American history, authorizing the construction of more than 200 warships, including 18 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers. The price tag was staggering, $4 billion at a time when the entire federal budget was less than $10 billion. Critics called it wasteful, unnecessary, a capitulation to war hysteria. Isolationists argued that America should focus on defending its own shores, not preparing to fight wars on two oceans simultaneously. But Roosevelt understood what they did not. The oceans were not moats protecting America from the world's conflicts. They were highways, and control of those highways would determine the outcome of the coming war. He did not know when America would be forced to fight, but he knew that when the moment came, the nation's survival would depend on steel hulls and aircraft carriers, not speeches and neutrality pacts. American industry in 1940 was still emerging from the shadow of the Great Depression, but its potential was enormous. The same factories that had once produced automobiles, refrigerators, and washing machines could be retooled to produce tanks, aircraft, and ships. The same workforce that had stood in bread lines could be mobilized to work double shifts in shipyards and munitions plants. The same rail networks that carried grain and coal could carry steel plating and artillery shells. What America lacked in military tradition, it more than compensated for in industrial infrastructure. When war finally came in December 1941, the machinery of mobilization was already in motion. Shipyards that had been quiet for years roared back to life. New facilities were built almost overnight. Mare Island in California, which had launched its first warship in the 19th century, expanded its workforce from 6,000 to 40,000. The Philadelphia Navy Yard, nestled along the Delaware River, became a forest of cranes and scaffolding. Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia, already one of the largest private shipyards in the world, began operating around the clock 7 days a week. The contrast with Japan was stark and growing starker. Japan's shipbuilding capacity was concentrated in a handful of facilities: Kure Naval Arsenal, Yokosuka, Sasebo, Nagasaki. These yards were staffed by skilled workers and capable of producing advanced warships, but they were limited by geography, resources, and infrastructure. Japan lacked the vast reserves of steel, oil, and aluminum that modern naval construction demanded. Every ton of metal used in a battleship was a ton that could not be used in aircraft, tanks, or merchant vessels. Every rivet driven into a carrier's hull represented a choice, a trade-off, a sacrifice. America faced no such constraints. Its steel mills in Pittsburgh and Gary churned out millions of tons annually. Its oil fields in Texas and Oklahoma produced more petroleum in a single month than Japan's entire empire could generate in a year. Its aluminum plants, powered by hydroelectric dams in the Pacific Northwest, supplied the raw material for tens of thousands of aircraft. When American war planners looked at production charts and resource assessments, they did not see limitations, they saw possibilities. And so, while Japanese commanders celebrated victories at sea and on jungle islands, American shipyards began to build, not slowly, not cautiously, but with a speed and scale that would have seemed fantastical just years earlier. The war Japan thought it was fighting, a war of skill, courage, and tactical brilliance, was about to be overwhelmed by a different kind of conflict entirely. A war of assembly lines, of welding torches, of industrial capacity measured not in dozens of ships, but in hundreds. The weeping in Tokyo had not yet begun, but the moment of reckoning was approaching. The workers arrived before dawn. In shipyards from Brooklyn to San Francisco, from Seattle to New Orleans, men and women streamed through gates in the pre-morning darkness, clutching lunch pails and thermoses, their breath visible in the cold air. Many were farmers who had never seen an ocean. Others were housewives who had never held a wrench. Some were teenagers, barely out of high school, suddenly responsible for welding joints that would hold under the pressure of enemy shells and Pacific storms. They came because the pay was good, because the work mattered, because their brothers and sons were fighting on distant islands and they wanted to do their part. The face of Rosie the Riveter became iconic, but the reality was far grittier than any poster. Women made up a significant portion of the shipyard workforce, sometimes as much as one-third of all laborers. They operated cranes, fitted pipes, installed electrical systems, and yes, drove rivets into steel plating with pneumatic hammers that rattled teeth and left arms numb. The work was dangerous. Accidents were common. Falls from scaffolding, burns from welding torches, crushed limbs from swinging steel beams. Yet absenteeism remained low. Production targets were met, then exceeded. Shifts ran 24 hours. When one crew clocked out, another clocked in, and the work continued under floodlights that turned night into artificial day. The human cost of this industrial mobilization is easy to overlook when discussing tonnage and production statistics, but it was real, and it was paid daily. Workers endured grueling conditions, injuries, exhaustion. Families were uprooted as laborers migrated to shipyard towns, living in hastily built housing projects and trailer parks. Social tensions flared, but through it all, the ships grew. Keels were laid, hulls took shape, superstructures rose toward the sky. The technology that made this possible was as revolutionary as the workforce. Before the war, shipbuilding was a slow, methodical craft. Vessels were constructed piece by piece, riveted together over months or even years. American shipyards threw out the old methods and embraced techniques borrowed from automobile manufacturing. Prefabrication became the key. Rather than building a ship from the keel up in a single location, entire sections, complete with wiring, plumbing, and compartments, were assembled in warehouses and then transported to the slipway to be welded together. It was faster, more efficient, and allowed for mass production on a scale previously unimaginable. Welding itself was a game changer. Traditional riveting was labor-intensive and time-consuming. Welded seams were stronger, quicker to create, and required fewer workers. American yards trained thousands of welders in crash courses lasting just weeks. The quality was sometimes inconsistent, and early Liberty ships suffered from catastrophic hull failures in cold water, but improvements came rapidly. Engineers learned from mistakes. Metallurgy improved. By 1943, welded construction was standard, and the ships being launched were not only faster to build but more reliable than their riveted predecessors. Admiral Yamamoto had seen this coming. He had spent years in the United States as a naval attaché and student, and he understood the American culture in ways his colleagues did not. He knew that Americans approached problems with a ruthless pragmatism, a willingness to discard tradition in favor of efficiency. He had tried to explain this to the Naval General Staff, tried to make them understand that American industrial capacity was not just a matter of numbers but of mindset. A nation that could mass-produce automobiles could mass-produce warships. A society that valued innovation and efficiency over rigid adherence to tradition would find ways to build faster, cheaper, and in greater quantity. But Tokyo did not listen, or perhaps they listened and simply could not believe. The Japanese military establishment was steeped in notions of bushido, of honor, of the superiority of spirit over material. The idea that a war could be won not by superior warriors but by superior factories seemed almost offensive. And so Yamamoto's warnings were acknowledged but not acted upon. The war plan proceeded as if American industry were a minor inconvenience rather than an existential threat. The numbers, when they are laid out plainly, are almost difficult to comprehend. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards launched 8 fleet carriers of the Essex class. Each displaced more than 27,000 tons and could carry up to 90 aircraft. They were fast, well-armored, and packed with anti-aircraft guns. But the Essex-class carriers were only part of the story. 9 Independence-class light carriers converted from cruiser hulls joined the fleet. They were smaller, faster, and could be built in a fraction of the time. Then came the escort carriers, over 70 of them, cheap, mass-produced vessels built on merchant hulls designed to provide air cover for convoys and amphibious landings. Japan, by contrast, completed only 6 fleet carriers during the entire war, and several of those were conversions of existing ships. By 1943, Japanese carrier aviation had been gutted at Midway, and attrition had taken a brutal toll on trained pilots. Even when Japan managed to launch a new carrier, there were often no experienced air crews to fly from its decks. The disparity extended to every class of warship. American yards launched more than 350 destroyers during the war. Japan built fewer than 40. The United States produced over 400 submarines. Japan built fewer than 200 Liberty ships, the unglamorous cargo vessels that kept the American war machine supplied, rolled off the ways at a rate of 3 per day at the program's peak. Japan's merchant marine, by contrast, was being systematically annihilated by American submarines, and Japanese yards could not replace losses fast enough to sustain supply lines. Japanese intelligence officers tracked these developments with growing alarm. Reports filtered in from neutral countries, from agents operating undercover in the Americas, from decoded American communications. Each report painted the same picture, an industrial avalanche that Japan had no hope of stopping or even slowing. Staff officers compiled charts comparing Japanese and American production. The lines on those charts diverged like the paths of two runners, one sprinting ahead while the other stumbled and fell further behind with each passing month. The psychological impact on Japanese naval leadership was profound. These were men who had devoted their lives to the study of naval warfare, who had planned for decades to fight a decisive battle against the American fleet. They had studied Tsushima, the great victory of 1905 when Admiral Togo's fleet annihilated the Russian Navy. They believed in the possibility of a climactic engagement where superior training and tactics would overcome numerical disadvantage. But how do you fight a climactic battle when the enemy can lose a dozen ships and replace them in weeks, while every Japanese loss is irreplaceable? The resource war was equally lopsided. Steel was the lifeblood of modern naval construction, and the United States produced more than 60 million tons of steel in 1943 alone. Japan's total production that same year was less than 8 million tons. Oil was even more critical. Ships, planes, tanks, all were useless without fuel. American production exceeded 5 million barrels per day. Japan, even with access to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, struggled to produce a fraction of that amount, and American submarines were sinking the tankers that carried precious fuel from Southeast Asia to the home islands. Aluminum, rubber, copper. In every category of strategic material, the imbalance was crushing. Japan's leaders had gambled that a short, victorious war would force a negotiated peace before these disparities could matter. But the war was not short. It ground on, month after month, and with each passing season the gap widened. American factories churned out weapons and ships faster than Japan could destroy them. Japanese factories, starved of raw materials and battered by air raids, struggled to maintain even minimal production levels. There was a bitter irony in this. Japan had gone to war in part to secure access to resources: oil from the Indies, burr from Malaya, rice from Indochina. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was supposed to create a self-sufficient economic bloc that could withstand Western pressure. But resource extraction and transportation required time, infrastructure, and above all, security of sea lanes. American submarines and aircraft ensured that Japan never had any of those things. The resources Japan had fought to control remained tantalizingly out of reach, sitting in warehouses and fields while the home island starved. The year 1943 was when reality became undeniable. January saw the commissioning of USS Essex, the lead ship of her class, the first of the new fleet carriers to join the Pacific Fleet. In April, USS Yorktown, not the carrier lost at Midway, but a new vessel bearing the same proud name, entered service. May brought USS Lexington, another name resurrected from earlier loss. June, July, August, each month brought new hulls, new air wings, new firepower streaming westward across the Pacific. At Trucatal, the great Japanese naval base in the Caroline Islands, intelligence officers compiled reports and photographs. Reconnaissance flights over American bases in Hawaii and the South Pacific brought back images of harbors crowded with warships. Signals intelligence intercepted American communications, revealing the movement of new task forces, new air groups, new divisions. The evidence was overwhelming, but it still had to be compiled, analyzed, and presented to senior command. The report that landed on desks in Tokyo that November was comprehensive and devastating. It listed every major American warship known to have been completed in the past 12 months. Fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers, battleships including the new Iowa-class fast battleships, each capable of over 30 knots and armed with 9 16-inch guns. Cruisers, destroyers, destroyer escorts, submarines, page after page of hull numbers, commissioning dates, and specifications. But numbers alone, sterile and abstract, did not convey the full horror. It was the photographs that did that. Images of shipyards with multiple carriers under construction simultaneously. Aerial reconnaissance showing rows of destroyers lined up like cars in a parking lot. Shots of launching ceremonies where ships slid into the water while others were still being assembled on adjacent slips. The photographs made it visceral, undeniable. Admiral Osami Nagano, chief of the Naval General Staff, reviewed the report in silence. He was an old man, nearly 70, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and a lifetime of service. He had believed in Japan's destiny, in the righteousness of the cause, in the possibility of victory through courage and sacrifice. Now he stared at photographs of American shipyards and understood that courage was irrelevant. You cannot fight a tide, you cannot defeat mathematics. The meeting that followed was subdued. There was no panic, no shouting. Japanese military culture prized stoicism, and these were professional officers who had spent their lives mastering their emotions. But the silence in the room was thick with despair. Some officers leafed through the report, pausing on particular pages as if hoping the numbers would change if they looked long enough. Others sat motionless, staring at nothing. Vice Admiral Ito, who had laid the photographs on the table, he at the beginning spoke quietly. "We are not losing the war. The war is already lost. We are simply waiting for the Americans to finish building the fleet that will destroy us." No one contradicted him. By mid-1944, the truth of his words would become undeniable on the battlefield itself. In June, American forces invaded Saipan in the Mariana Islands. The Japanese fleet, including most of its remaining carriers, sortied to intercept. The Battle of the Philippine Sea was the largest carrier engagement since Midway, but it was not a battle in any traditional sense. It was a slaughter. The Japanese assembled 9 carriers for the operation. The Americans brought 15, including 7 Essex-class fleet carriers and 8 light carriers. Japanese aircraft flown by pilots with minimal training were intercepted by American fighters directed by radar. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, June 19, 1944, Japanese naval aviation lost more than 300 aircraft. American losses were fewer than 30. The disparity was so one-sided that some American pilots struggled to find targets. Japanese carriers Taiho and Shokaku, 2 of the fleet's most valuable ships, were sunk by American submarines. A third carrier, Hiyo, was destroyed by aircraft. The mobile fleet, as the Japanese carrier force was known, limped back to Okinawa and then to the home islands, having accomplished nothing. It would never again operate as a unified force. Japanese naval aviation, already crippled by losses at Midway and in the grinding attrition of the Solomon Islands campaign, effectively ceased to exist as an offensive weapon. American losses in the battle were minimal. A few aircraft, a handful of pilots. Within weeks, replacement planes and pilots arrived from the United States. New carriers joined the fleet. The war machine did not pause. It did not even slow down. For the Japanese commanders who survived the battle, the experience was surreal. They had grown up in a navy that prided itself on night fighting skills, on torpedo tactics, on the belief that superior training and morale could overcome material disadvantage. But there was no overcoming what they faced in the Philippine Sea. American fighters were faster, better armed, and flown by pilots with hundreds of hours of training. American ships bristled with radar-directed anti-aircraft guns that filled the sky with lethal flak. American damage control teams could save ships that would have been abandoned as lost causes in the Japanese fleet. And behind it all, endlessly, was the production. Every ship sunk could be replaced. Every plane shot down would be matched by 2 more rolling-off assembly lines. Every pilot killed was mourned, but there were always more young men completing training and shipping out to join the fleet. Japan had no such reserves. Every loss was permanent. Every experienced pilot killed represented years of training that could not be replicated. Every carrier sunk was irreplaceable. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, who commanded the Japanese carriers at the Philippine Sea, wrote later that he had known before the battle that victory was impossible. His goal had been simply to inflict enough damage on the American fleet to delay the inevitable for a few more months. He failed even in that limited objective. The American advance continued without pause. Saipan fell, then Tinian, then Guam. American B-29 bombers operating from bases in the Marianas began flying missions over the Japanese home islands. The war that Japan had started in hopes of securing a defensive perimeter had come home. In the months that followed, Japanese naval strategy devolved into desperation. Surface forces, starved of fuel and air cover, remained in port or ventured out only for suicide missions. The super battleships Yamato and Musashi, the symbols of Japanese naval power, were reduced to floating targets. Musashi was sunk by American aircraft during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, absorbing dozens of torpedo and bomb hits before finally capsizing. Yamato survived a few months longer before being sent on a one-way mission to Okinawa in April 1945, where she was overwhelmed and destroyed by wave after wave of American carrier aircraft The kamikazes, the suicide pilots who deliberately crashed their planes into American ships, were born from this desperation. When conventional tactics failed, when trained pilots were gone, when fuel and aircraft were scarce, the only option left was to turn men into weapons. The kamikazes inflicted damage and spread fear, but they changed nothing. American ships kept coming. American production kept churning. For every ship damaged or sunk, two more arrived. Japanese commanders who had once believed in decisive battle and the possibility of a second Tsushima now understood that they were fighting a war that could not be won through bravery or tactics. They were fighting a war of industrial capacity, and in that contest, Japan had been overmatched from the very beginning. The tears shed in Tokyo were not just for ships and sailors lost. They were for the recognition that every assumption, every plan, every hope had been built on a foundation of illusion. When the war ended in August 1945, the numbers told a story that needed no embellishment. The United States had built more than 100 carriers of all types during the war. Japan built 6 fleet carriers and a handful of smaller vessels. The United States launched over 350 destroyers. Japan managed fewer than 40. American shipyards produced more than 5,000 merchant and cargo vessels. Japan's merchant fleet, essential to its survival as an island nation, had been reduced to a shattered remnant, its ships lying on the bottom of the Pacific or rusting in harbors, unusable due to lack of fuel. The human cost on both sides was staggering, but the material imbalance was what had determined the outcome. Japan lost approximately 400,000 military personnel in naval and air operations. The United States suffered over 100,000 dead in the Pacific theater, but where Japanese losses were irreplaceable. American losses, terrible as they were, could be absorbed. The flow of men and material never stopped. Japanese naval strategy, so carefully crafted over decades, collapsed under the weight of American industrial output. The concept of decisive battle became meaningless when the enemy could lose the battle and still win the war. The emphasis on quality over quantity, on building a smaller number of superior ships, proved to be a fatal miscalculation. Yamato's 18-inch guns, impressive as they were, never fired at an enemy surface ship in anger. The super battleship spent most of the war hiding in port, too valuable to risk, too slow and vulnerable to use effectively in the age of carrier warfare. Japanese carriers, even when available, lacked aircraft and trained pilots. The brutal attrition of 1942 and 1943 had gutted the elite cadre of naval aviators who had struck Pearl Harbor and rampaged across the Pacific. Replacements were rushed through training programs with minimal flight hours. They were brave, willing to die, but skill is not learned through willingness alone. American pilots, by contrast, received hundreds of hours of training before seeing combat. They flew better aircraft, supported by better intelligence, guided by radar, and recovered by an efficient search and rescue system. When an American pilot was shot down, there was a good chance he would be picked up and returned to duty. Japanese pilots who went into the water often vanished. The kamikaze campaign, launched in desperation as conventional options evaporated, epitomized Japan's strategic bankruptcy. Thousands of young men flew their planes into American ships, dying in explosions of fire and twisted metal. They sank dozens of ships and damaged hundreds more. But they did not stop the American advance. They could not. For every ship sunk by a kamikaze, American shipyards launched replacements. The arithmetic was brutal and unyielding. Japan was spending lives it could not replace to destroy ships that would be replaced within weeks. There is a photograph taken in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945 that captures the end. The battleship USS Missouri, a massive Iowa-class ship completed in 1944, sits at anchor surrounded by dozens of American warships. On Missouri's deck, Japanese officials signed the instrument of surrender. The ship they stand on, the fleet arrayed around them, the aircraft circling overhead, all of it represents the industrial and military dominance that had crushed the Japanese Empire. In the years following the war, surviving Japanese naval officers wrote memoirs and gave interviews. Many returned again and again to the same theme: the shock of discovering the scale of American production. Admiral Yamamoto, who served as Navy minister, admitted in post-war interrogations that Japanese leadership had fundamentally misunderstood American resolve and capacity. They had believed that a few sharp defeats would lead America to negotiate. They had not imagined that America would mobilize its entire economy, that factories in places Japanese officers had never heard of would produce warships by the dozens, that a nation an ocean away would project power on a scale never before seen in human history. Admiral Toyota Suemu, who became commander-in-chief of the combined fleet in 1944, acknowledged that by the time he assumed command, the war was already unwinnable. His task was not to achieve victory, but to delay defeat, to make the Americans pay as high a price as possible in hopes that they would tire of the bloodshed. But the Americans did not tire. They kept coming, wave after wave, supported by a fleet that seemed to grow larger every month. The American shipyards that had built this fleet became legends. Kaiser Shipyards, operated by industrialist Henry Kaiser, pioneered mass production techniques and built Liberty ships in an average of 42 days. One ship, the Robert E. P. Erie, was completed in less than 5 days as a demonstration of what was possible. Newport News Shipbuilding, Bath Iron Works, Mare Island Naval Shipyard, these names became synonymous with American industrial might. The workers who had built the ships returned to civilian life. The shipyards contracted, some closing entirely as the nation demobilized. But the lesson of the war was not forgotten. Industrial capacity had proven to be as decisive as any battlefield tactic. The ability to outproduce an enemy, to replace losses faster than they could be inflicted, had won the war as surely as any admiral or general. For Japan, the lessons were equally clear but far more painful. Post-war Japanese society grappled with the catastrophe that its military leadership had brought upon the nation. The belief in spiritual superiority, in the power of will and courage to overcome material disadvantage, had led to ruin. Cities lay in ashes, millions were dead, the empire was gone, dissolved into history. Some of the most poignant reflections came from the junior officers who had compiled the intelligence reports in late 1943. They had seen the truth early, had documented the scale of American production, and had presented it to their superiors. But institutional inertia, cultural assumptions, and the impossibility of admitting that the war was lost had prevented any meaningful change in strategy. By the time the weeping began in Tokyo, it was far too late. The ships were already built, the fleet was already at sea, the outcome was already written. The statistical comparison, laid out in cold numbers, is overwhelming. United States, 24 fleet and light carriers completed during the war. Japan, 6 fleet carriers. United States, 18 escort carriers built in a single shipyard. Japan, total escort carrier production barely reached double digits. United States, 10 battleships commissioned. And between 1941 and 1945. Japan, 2 battleships completed, both of them already under construction before the war began. These numbers do not capture the sleepless nights in shipyard towns, the women who learned to weld, the families who sacrificed, the industrial mobilization that turned a peacetime economy into a war machine. But they do capture the outcome. Japan had bet on quality, on tactics, on the belief that superior warriors could overcome inferior numbers. America had bet on production, on logistics, on the cold mathematics of industrial war. The result was never in doubt, not really. It simply took time for everyone to realize it. The tears shed in that Tokyo conference room in late 1943 were not merely about ships or statistics. They were the tears of men who had devoted their lives to the mastery of naval warfare, only to discover that the war they had prepared for was not the war they were fighting. They had studied tactics and strategy, gunnery and maneuver, the great naval battles of history. But the war that destroyed them was not won or lost in battles. It was won in shipyards, in factories, in the unglamorous work of welding and riveting, of assembly lines and production quotas. There is something almost impersonal about industrial warfare, a coldness that strips away the romance of combat and reduces conflict to mathematics. But that impersonality is precisely what makes it so devastating. Courage cannot defeat a production line. Honor cannot sink a ship that has not yet been built. Spirit, no matter how fierce, cannot replace steel. The Japanese commanders understood this too late. They wept not from cowardice but from clarity. They saw the future and knew that everything they had fought for, every sacrifice made, every life spent, had been in service of a cause that was already lost. The ships being built in American yards were not just vessels. They were inevitability made steel. They were the physical embodiment of a truth that Japan's leadership had refused to accept. That in modern war, industrial capacity is destiny. The legacy of this moment extends far beyond World War II. The lesson that production wins wars, that economic strength underpins military power, shaped the Cold War and continues to influence strategic thinking today. Nations that aspire to great power status must first build great industries. Fleets and armies are only as strong as the factories and shipyards that supply them. And so the tears in Tokyo were not just for a lost war. They were for a lost world, for a time when warriors and warships could determine the fate of nations. That time ended in the Pacific, drowned beneath a flood of American steel. What rose in its place was a new era, one in which the factory floor mattered as much as the battlefield, and the welder's torch was as powerful as the admiral's sword. The men who wept in 1943 understood this. They wept because they had no choice but to understand.